In this lesson, we're going to access remote data using JSON web services. In the last lesson, we used WCF, and we saw that that was pretty easy to do once we set up the proxy. But JSON is a little bit lighter. WCF uses SOAP and XML, so the payload is a bit heavy, and underneath the wraps there's a fair amount of complication. JSON essentially uses web requests, gets and posts, using HTTP. The other reason that you might need to use JSON is you might be calling a web service that was set up to service web pages in AJAX, and quite often those use a JSON technique as well as opposed to WCF. So we're going to do the same login form where we have a username, password, a login, cancel, and a result. And we have our button login, and we're going to read our text username and text password, and this is where we start to get into the request. We first have a URL of the service and the method that we're going to be calling in the service. Then we create a JSON object to pass into the service method, and a JSON object is essentially just key and value pairs. In our case, we have two parameters, the username, where we pass in the key and the value, and the password, key and value. These, by the way, are case sensitive. We take that JSON object and toString it, and that's going to be our request body. And then we encode it with UTF-8. Now we use a standard HTTP web request object. And we get its content length from our body length. The method we're going to use is post, and the content type is JSON. And finally, we'll create a stream writer to stream the request body into the request. And we close the stream, and we begin the request. This is done asynchronously, so we're looking for a callback, and that's in the getResponse. So this method sends the request, and then we'll await the response in this callback method. Once this callback method is called, we'll get the request and its result. So here's our response that we're getting from the request object. And we create a stream reader off of that to get the response stream. And then we create a JSON object to capture the response. And we load it from the stream reader that's from the response. So finally we have ourselves a JSON object. Now the JSON object is also a key value pair. It can also be an array of key value pairs. In this case, our service cleverly named our response D. So we have a Boolean response, either true or false, as to whether the login was good, under the J object index D. And finally, we use that result to indicate whether our login was successful or it failed. We'll run this. So here's our login form. And I'm just going to try to log in without anything at this point. And it takes a little time to get the request object going, and you can see the login failed. Now if I type in the correct credentials, and you can see the login was successful, and a heck of a lot quicker that time as well. So that's how to access remote data using JSON. The choice of whether to use WCF or JSON may come down to a personal preference, but it may also be a performance preference or a preference as to what the technology is on the web server that you're provided. WCF essentially gives you a nicer interface to work with in terms of objects, while JSON is probably a little bit better in performance and is a bit simpler under the wraps. JSON, however, as you can see, is a little bit more complex in terms of actually coding it. So there's a trade-off there.